don't follow the news.
Right.
I don't watch.
You don't watch the Today Show.
No.
So this was a complete
Yes,
shock.
it was.
What kind
was
of questions were they asking you?
Nothing. They didn't ask me no questions.
So they
nothing,
just said,
nothing. They
so they
just
took
sent me
you-
in the car. They investigated my car and this one, and that's it. They didn't ask me no questions, no nothing.
Did you get
Today, something happened near the Arizona-Mexico border that temporarily redirected the entire public narrative. A man, later referred to publicly as Carlos, was detained at a traffic stop near Rio Rico, roughly 60 miles south of Tucson. At the same time, investigators executed a search warrant on a nearby property. The operation involved multiple law enforcement agencies. It looked from the outside like a major break. Within hours, the man was released. Investigators determined he had no connection to the case. What matters about this moment is not what was found. It is what it reveals about how this investigation has operated from the beginning. In a case with more than 30,000 tips flowing in, with ransom notes arriving from multiple directions, with a high-profile victim whose daughter is one of the most recognizable journalists in the United States, the pressure to produce visible progress is relentless. Operations get mounted. People get questioned. The machinery of a major investigation runs at full speed. And sometimes, the machinery pulls in the wrong direction. There is a version of this story where that is simply the nature of complex investigations. Follow every credible lead, eliminate every possibility, and eventually the picture clarifies. And there is another version where every misdirection costs something, where every resource deployed on a dead end is a resource not deployed on the right thread. And the distinction matters here because of what was happening with the most important piece of forensic evidence in the entire case, and how it was being handled. There is one detail in this case that has never fully been explained. On the morning of February 2nd, 2026, when investigators first walked through Nancy Guthrie's home in the Catalina foothills north of Tucson, they found something that immediately changed the nature of the case. There was blood on the front porch, confirmed as hers. There was a security camera that had been deliberately tampered with. And yet, there was no forced entry, not a single broken window, not a single damaged lock. Every door, every point of access was intact. When you hold those two things together, the blood and the undamaged locks, something doesn't align. Because one of them says violence happened here, and the other says that whoever caused it was allowed inside. That is where this investigation begins. Not with a headline, not with a name, but with a door that was never broken down, and what that single fact quietly implies about everything that followed. If you're watching this for the first time, you're in the right place. This is InvestiCrime Files, and we don't stop until the full picture emerges. To understand what happened, you first have to understand who Nancy Guthrie was, because this case has been covered as a headline, and headlines have a way of reducing people to the worst moment of their lives rather than the sum of everything that came before it. Nancy Ellen Long was born in Fort Wright, Kentucky in January 1942. She had been a resident of the Tucson area for more than 5 decades. A woman who built her life quietly, deliberately, and with deep roots in her community. She raised 5 children, largely on her own after her husband Charles died during a mining exploration trip in Mexico in 1988. She was 46 years old when she became a widow. She kept going. By 2026, she was 84. She had mobility limitations. She could not walk 50 yards without assistance. She relied on daily medication that, according to Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos, could become life-threatening within 24 hours of being missed. She had a pacemaker. She was, in the clinical language of risk assessment, medically fragile. But fragility is not the same as smallness. The people who knew Nancy described someone who was still fully present, sharp, warm, grounded. She was a grandmother. She volunteered. She was known for showing up. And on the morning of February 2nd, 2026, she did not show up for church. When her family could not reach her, they called 911. What investigators found when they arrived at her home set the tone for everything that came after. The porch, the blood, the camera, the intact locks, and a woman who was gone. Here is what the verified timeline tells us about the hours before Nancy disappeared. On the evening of Saturday, January 31st, she was not alone. She had dinner with family members. She played cards. She was seen, spoken to, accounted for. Around 9:50 that evening, she returned home. She went inside. That is the last confirmed moment anyone in her circle saw her alive. The next morning, Sunday, February 1st, she missed church. The calls went unanswered. And when family arrived at her home in the Catalina foothills, what they found was enough to prompt a 911 call that would, within 48 hours, transform from a missing persons report into a criminal investigation. Blood on the front porch. Security camera tampered with, the device removed from its mounting. Personal items left behind, items she would not have left voluntarily, including medication she needed to survive. No forced entry. Sheriff Nanos would later state directly that this was not a dementia-related disappearance. Nancy was mentally present. Whatever happened at that house, she understood it was happening. When investigators declared the home a formal crime scene and brought in homicide detectives, they were not being cautious. They were responding to what the physical evidence was telling them. Something violent enough to leave blood had occurred at that entry point, and whatever came next had been carefully managed because the camera that should have recorded it had been deliberately disabled. At this point in the investigation, the first major analytical question took shape. Not just who did this, but how long had they been preparing to? The footage that answered part of that question almost didn't exist. In the initial days of the investigation, the Pima County Sheriff's Office assessed the doorbell camera footage from Nancy's Nest security system and determined that it was unrecoverable. The data was too degraded. The image was gone. Then the FBI arrived and brought it back. What they recovered, and subsequently released to the public, became the clearest forensic portrait of a suspect the investigation had produced. A figure standing at Nancy Guthrie's front door, armed, every inch of his face and body concealed. Dark clothing, black gloves, sneakers. And on his back, a specific, identifiable piece of gear, an Ozark Trail 25-liter hiking pack. The FBI described him as approximately 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10 inches tall, average build. His posture at the door was deliberate. He appeared to know where the camera was. He had come prepared to disable it. This is the moment where two analytical threads begin running in parallel, and where the investigation starts to get more complicated. Thread 1. This person had planned this. The level of preparation, the masking, the gloves, the equipment, either the apparent knowledge of the camera position, does not belong to an impulse decision. This was not someone who walked past a house and made a choice in the moment. Thread 2. If that footage was initially deemed unrecoverable, what else might have been overlooked? And here is where the geography of this neighborhood becomes an active, investigative variable, not background detail. The Catalina foothills is not a typical suburban neighborhood. Each property sits on between 1 and 4 acres. The desert vegetation between homes is dense, cactus, brush, rock, thick enough that even on a clear day, a neighbor 3 doors down cannot see what is happening at your front door. At night, it is darker still. A local ordinance limits outdoor lighting to protect the area's dark skies. A person familiar with that terrain could move through it on foot, between properties, along dry desert paths, without ever stepping onto a road covered by a single camera. Investigators understood this, and when they issued a request for neighborhood surveillance footage, they did not ask for footage from the days surrounding the disappearance. They asked for footage going all the way back to January 1st, a full month before Nancy vanished. That request does not get made without a reason. When you ask for 30 days of prior footage, you are operating on the belief that someone was in that neighborhood before the crime was committed. Watching, mapping, learning the entry and exit points, learning the rhythms of the household. The Catalina foothills is confusing territory. The roads wind and fork. There are cul-de-sacs that dead end without warning. It is not the kind of neighborhood you navigate confidently on a first visit, which raises a question that the investigation has not publicly answered. How well did this person know where they were going? You're watching InvestiCrime Files. If this investigation is raising questions you haven't considered before, stay with us. Because the next layer of this case is where things get significantly more complicated. Inside Nancy Guthrie's home, investigators had found something that should have been, in any straightforward calculus, the most powerful tool available to them. DNA, not Nancy's DNA. Unknown. DNA. Biological material left behind by someone who had no business being inside that house. The sheriff's office confirmed it publicly. The DNA recovered from the scene did not match Nancy Guthrie and did not match anyone associated with her household. Family members had been tested. Service workers who had regular access to the property, landscapers, pool maintenance, Uber drivers, had been ruled out. What remained was the genetic trace of a stranger. And then the analysis went further. Experts working on the sample determined that it was not a simple single contributor sample. It was a complex mixture containing genetic material from 3 or more individuals. At least one of those contributors was male. I would assume it would be Nancy plus 2 or more unknowns, said genetic genealogist C.C. Moore, one of the leading experts in forensic genetic genealogy in the United States. 3 or more unknowns. So inside the home of an 84-year-old woman who couldn't walk 50 yards unassisted and who, by every account, was living a quiet and private life. The single masked figure from the doorbell footage, was that still the whole picture? At this point, the investigation's early framing, one suspect, one crime, one night, begins to show its first real fracture line. But here is where the timeline of this case takes a turn that is harder to explain than the crime itself. The FBI requested access to the DNA sample. Their laboratory at Quantico has some of the most advanced forensic genetic technology in the world, including capabilities for forensic genealogy analysis, the same methodology that cracked the Golden State Killer case after decades of failure through conventional means. Applied to this sample, that technology represented a genuine opportunity to build a suspect profile, even without a direct database match. The sample was not sent to Quantico. It was sent instead to a private laboratory in Florida, a lab that the Pima County Sheriff's Office had an existing contract with. 11 weeks later, that lab transferred the original hair sample to the FBI for analysis. 11 weeks. In a kidnapping case where the victim's medication was described as potentially fatal within 24 hours of being missed. 11 weeks between when the FBI first requested the sample and when it arrived in their hands. The FBI's public response was careful but pointed. This is not new information. The FBI asked to test this DNA 2 months ago with the same technology we've always had, when the local sheriff instead sent it to a private lab. When you sit with that statement alongside the confirmed timeline, a structural question emerges that has nothing to do with speculation. Did the handling of this evidence slow down the investigation's ability to identify a suspect? And if it did, what were the consequences of that delay for Nancy Guthrie? Sheriff Nanos has disputed any suggestion of conflict or withholding. He stated that he called the FBI the Monday after Nancy went missing, that the Florida lab choice made logistical sense given prior chain of custody, and that the reporting of any friction between his office and federal investigators was incorrect. Both versions cannot be simultaneously true. And as of this recording, no independent confirmation has resolved which account of events is accurate. What is confirmed by the FBI's own public statement is that the sample arrived 11 weeks after it was first requested. The investigation is still running on partial visibility. On the night of February 13th, something shifted again. A major law enforcement operation unfolded in a residential neighborhood approximately 2 miles from Nancy's home. SWAT vehicles, more than 24 deputies, forensic units, FBI evidence response teams arriving in numbers, roads blocked, lights cutting through the desert dark. A level of force that, to anyone watching from the perimeter, signaled that this was not a precautionary sweep. 3 individuals were detained, a man and a woman taken from a residence, and a third individual pulled from a traffic stop near a fast food restaurant close to the target property. Sources indicated the operations were coordinated, that investigators had waited for the traffic stop before moving on the house. The operation ran for hours. FBI agents were described as working through the night, collecting evidence. By morning, no arrests had been made. The individuals were released. A statement confirmed that the man questioned had cooperated fully and was not the suspect. Another thread followed carefully and folded closed. But the evidence collection at that house continued. Whatever investigators were looking for inside that residence, they took their time finding it, or not finding it, and the details of what was recovered or what wasn't have not been publicly disclosed. The investigation absorbed another major operation, and Nancy Guthrie remained missing. We're going to pause here for a moment because this is the part of the case that tends to get lost in the coverage of individual developments. InvestiCrime Files. If you're finding this investigation valuable, subscribe now, because the next layer of this story is where the picture starts to change. There is a detail in the ransom dimension of this case that deserves careful examination, not because it points toward resolution, but because of what it reveals about how much noise can surround a case like this and how difficult that noise makes the signal. Multiple ransom notes were received by media outlets in the days following Nancy's disappearance. Different demands, different formats. A cryptocurrency demand of $6 million surfaced with a deadline that passed without confirmed contact. A second deadline passed. On February 5th, the same day the FBI publicly described the masked suspect, a California man was arrested on federal charges for posing as an abductor and demanding ransom from the Guthrie family. He had no connection to the actual crime. At least one of the ransom threads that generated significant public attention was, in the judgment of federal investigators, a fraud. A scheme built on a family's worst moment. And yet, that cannot rule out every ransom communication, because not every note has been publicly confirmed as fraudulent, and the question of motive has never been definitively resolved. Was Nancy taken for financial leverage? Was this connected somehow to her identity as the mother of a nationally recognized journalist? Or was the motive something else entirely? Something that hasn't surfaced in the public record? That question has no verified answer. What it has is weight. 24 days after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, her daughter Savannah Guthrie sat in front of a camera and said something that moved the emotional axis of the entire story. She acknowledged that her mother may already be gone. She described her family as blowing on the embers of hope. She said in an interview that aired nationally, "I'm so sorry, Mommy, I'm so sorry." She expressed the belief, raw and unguarded, that in some way her public profile may have made her mother a target, that her own success had reached back and placed someone she loved in danger. That is a weight that cannot be quantified. And it is worth holding here, not for drama, but because it is the human core of a case that the news cycle has a tendency to process as a series of investigative updates. Nancy Guthrie is not a data point. She is an 84-year-old woman who raised 5 children, who spent 5 decades building a life in the Sonoran Desert, who did not leave her house voluntarily on the night of January 31st, 2026. And as of this recording, she has not been found. The investigation remains active. The DNA sample is now in the hands of the FBI laboratory for advanced analysis. Analysis that could potentially apply forensic genealogy methodology to identify a suspect even without a direct database match. That process, used successfully in other high-profile cold cases, you can trace biological material through extended family connections, finding third cousins, then second cousins, then narrowing toward a primary suspect. It is painstaking. It takes time, but it has worked before in cases where everything else failed. Search teams have continued to operate in the Tucson area. Authorities have briefed officials on both sides of the Arizona-Mexico border. More than 30,000 tips have been processed, according to public statements. And there is still the footage that wasn't supposed to exist. The masked figure at the door, armed, prepared, deliberate, standing at the threshold of a home he had no right to enter, wearing gloves that left no DNA, carrying a pack that could be identified by brand and size but has not yet led investigators publicly to a name. When you examine the architecture of this crime, the 30 days of possible prior surveillance, the knowledge of the camera positions, the specific equipment, the chosen hour, the deliberate disabling of the recording device, what stands out is not the chaos of it. What stands out is the patience. Whoever did this was not improvising, and that means somewhere in the weeks before February 1st, 2026, there is a trail that has not yet been fully traced. What remains unresolved is not a small list. The identity of the masked figure at the door remains publicly unknown. The complexity of the DNA sample, 3 or more contributors, has not been explained. The 11-week gap in the evidence chain has not been fully accounted for. Every ransom note's legitimacy has not been confirmed or denied. And the question of whether Nancy Guthrie is still alive, a question her own daughter has publicly begun to answer in the grief-weighted language of someone preparing for the worst, has no verified answer. What investigators have is a physical description, a piece of identified equipment, a surveillance request that stretches back 30 days before the crime, a forensic sample that is now, finally, in the hands of the most capable laboratory available, and a community of more than 30,000 people who came forward with information, at least some of which has not yet been fully processed. In cases like this, resolution often comes from the detail that seemed minor, the footage nobody thought to pull, the connection nobody thought to map, the forensic thread that looked exhausted but had one more inch to give. That detail may already exist somewhere in this investigation. It may be sitting in a database, waiting for the right query. It may be in the mind of someone who has not yet decided to speak. Because silence, in cases like this, has a tendency to crack. Not always loudly, not always cleanly, but eventually. The question this investigation is still asking, 11 weeks on, is not complicated. It is the same question it has been from the beginning. Where is Nancy? If you have any information related to the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, the Pima County Sheriff's Office and the FBI are actively accepting tips. The family has offered a $1 million reward for information leading to her recovery. That number is not a figure. It is a family's last loud act of hope. This is InvestiCrime Files. On every case we cover completely, not until it's trending, but until it's answered. If this investigation deserves your attention, share it, subscribe, and stay with us, because when the next development breaks in this case, we'll be the first ones back inside it.